This is wonderful. My name is Jake Greffenstedt. I'm the new director of the International Poetry Forum. Many of you know we were founded here in Pittsburgh in 1966. We ran until 2009 when the founder, Dr. Samuel Hazo, retired, and we just relaunched this year after a 15-year hiatus. We're so excited to be back. This is such a great way to spend a Tuesday evening with a few hundred of our closest friends listening to some poetry about hell. But we have a really special poet for you here tonight. The International Poetry Forum has hosted many of the great performers and poets of the last 60 years, figures like W.H. Auden, Gwendolyn Brooks, Seamus Heaney, Grace Kelly, James Earl Jones, really, really wonderful figures. And relaunching, we're thinking of our favorite poets and the poets we think are really the best to bring to Pittsburgh. And most poets that I cite in conversation, the response is, I love her work, or maybe I don't love her work. But with Srikanth Chicu Reddy, who we bring tonight, the initial response is almost always, I love him. And then, of course, I love his work. And to give you one example, so the International Poetry Forum does a number of things around town. We have this flagship reading series. We do a number of high school programs. And at one of our high school programs, the teacher came out to me and said, I heard that you're bringing Chicu Reddy to Pittsburgh. I adore him. I said, yeah, everybody seems to. And he said, no, you don't understand. I love Professor Reddy. I said, sure, I believe you, because no, he officiated my wedding. Had him as an undergraduate student at the University of Chicago, where Chicu now teaches. And I think Chicu is going to be a poet who endures, because he's not only a great poet, he's a great editor, a great educator, and he's someone who edifies the voices of other poets. So this is a real rising star I think you're going to hear more and more. Chicu Reddy finished his BA and PhD at Harvard University and completed his MFA at Iowa. He has spent some 20 years teaching at the University of Chicago in his hometown. He has several incredible books of poetry, including his latest, Underworld Lit, and several books of criticism and essays, including his latest, The Unsignificant, which is on sale from our partners here at City of Asylum Bookstore. There are moments in Reddy's poetry that are arresting. I remember as an undergraduate reading the first few lines of Dante, right, midway through life, finding oneself lost in the dark woods, and that just completely taking me out of myself and forcing me to take a moment to pause and contemplate my mortality, where I stood in my life. Reddy's work, which is interested in a number of things, but especially sort of various cultures' approaches to the underworld and the afterlife, does just that. So I encourage you to take the opportunity tonight to do just what Dr. Hazo envisioned when he founded the International Poetry Forum in 1966, which is to do the unusual thing and take 45 minutes listening to and reflecting on some great poetry. I'm so happy to have you all here. Thank you all for being supporters of this wonderful institution. Thank you for making this relaunch possible. Please join me in welcoming to the stage our poet, Chicu Reddy.
Thanks, Jake. And thank you all for coming here tonight. And thank you to everyone at the IPF, Sam Hazo, all the interns, Don, a lot of people come together to make space for poetry in the world. And this is a really special place. When Jake invited me out to read poetry of the afterlife and underworlds for you, I thought, oh no, I'm the hell guy. But then I realized it was actually a really thoughtful idea, because then I started kind of looking through my books and thinking, well, do I really obsess that much about death? And then I realized that yes, I do. So I'll read some poems from my first three books, but I'll also kind of like little commercial breaks. I'll read you some passages from other poets and other traditions, visions of the afterlife or of the worlds. And this first poem is actually the first poem in my first book of poetry. So you can see I was thinking about this stuff from the beginning. It's called Burial Practice. And I wrote it after I had learned of a meditation practice in Tibetan Buddhism, where you're asked to imagine the last moment of your existence in whatever form you may be in, and then imagine what happens next, and then what happens next, and then next, and next, and next, until you go out as far in time as you can make your mind go. And this, actually gives you a lot of perspective on things when you're frustrated about traffic. Burial practice. Then the pulse. Then a pause. Then twilight in a box. Dusk underfoot. Then generations. Then the same war by a different name. Wine splashing in a bucket. The erection, the era. Then exit reason. Then sadness without reason. Then the removal of the ceiling by hand. Then pages and pages of numbers. Then the page with the faint green stain. Then the page on which Prince Theodore, gravely wounded, is thrown onto a wagon. Then the page on which Masha weds somebody else. Then the page that turns to the story of somebody else. Then the page scribbled in dactyls. Then the page which begins, exit angel. Then the page wrapped around a dead fish. Then the page where the surfs reach the ocean. Then a nap. Then the peg. Then the page with the curious helmet. Then the page on which millet is ground. Then the death of Ursula. Then the stone page they raised over her head. Then the page made of grass, which goes on. Exit beauty. Then the page someone folded to mark her place. Then the page on which nothing happens, the page after this page. Then the transcript. Knocking within. Interpretation, then harvest. Exit want. Then a love story. Then a trip to the ruins. Then, and only then, the violet agenda. Then hope without reason. Then the construction of an underground passage between us. I think Jake might have gotten into Dante a little earlier in life than I did, but by the time I started writing this book, I was pretty into Dante. And I wrote a series of poems named after Dante's circles of hell and the inferno. And each one doesn't tell a story of, that's really Dante-esque, but it thinks about the sins that each of the souls that are placed in these different circles, whether it's lust or gluttony or the fraudulent, what those ways of thinking about morality and ethics meant to me. So this is a poem called Eighth Circle, the Circle of the Fraudulent, and the form of the poem is a kind of like Dante, who writes in a form called terza rima that's heavily rhymed in a cyclical pattern. But this poem is in the form of a villanelle that repeats lines and also does some rhyme. Eighth circle. Shadow of a bubble. Word, my world. 1. It issues from a shadow's mouth. Shadow one carries where one goes. One goes alone, and two go alone. 2. Without the sun, there would be no picnic. No picnic, no shadow of a bubble. No word, no world. 1. It issues from a shadow's mouth. Shadow of a boy blowing soap suds in the photo one carries where one goes. One goes alone to visit oneself. 3. Once it is blown, it casts across the blanket a mottled, hollow shadow of a bubble. Words whirl. 1. It issues from a shadow's mouth. Shadow. What issues from the broken box of bone one carries where one goes? One goes alone to the picnic. Father sits with his head of stone. Mother weeps on the blanket. Me? I blow the shadow of a bubble. My word, the world one carries. Where one goes alone. Maybe we'll do our first commercial Dante break. This is a passage from the Inferno. Many of you know this poem. Dante's pilgrim finds himself in the middle of life on a journey through the underworld. And he's guided by Virgil, the great Latin poet, who's his model of what it means to be an artist. And at this point, this is, I think, Canto 17 of the Inferno. Dante has been traveling with Virgil through the various circles of hell, meeting people who he knew in life, and also people from the ancient world and different periods and different parts of the world. And he gets to a tricky spot in the Inferno where he can't really cross this giant chasm. So hell has this really complex topography. It's actually circles within circles. It looks a little bit like this room you're in right now. But there's spots that you can't get across very easily. And so they need to hitch a ride across. And I won't read the whole canto because it's quite long. But Dante's been separated from Virgil, who's guiding him, and now he's rejoined with Virgil, and then they make the next step in their journey. And there's a terrifying monster who Virgil is coaxing Dante to come join him to climb on the back of the monster. I found my guide, who had already climbed upon the back of that brute animal, and he told me, "Be strong and daring now, for our descent is by this kind of stairs. You mount in front. I want to be between, so that the tail can't do you any harm." This is in the Ellen Mandelbaum translation. As one who feels the quartan fever near and shivers with his nails already blue, the sight of shade enough to make him shudder, so I became when I had heard these words. But then I felt the threat of shame, which makes a servant in his kind lord's presence brave. I settled down on those enormous shoulders. I wished to say, and yet my voice did not come as I thought, "See that you hold me tight." But he, who other times in other dangers sustained me, just as soon as I had mounted, clasped me within his arms and propped me up, and said, Now, Geryon, it's the name of the monster. Now, Geryon, move on. Take care to keep your circles wide. You're landing slow. Remember the new weight you're carrying. Just like a boat that starting from its moorings moves backward, so that beast took off. And when he felt himself completely clear, he turned his tail to where his chest had been, and having stretched it, moved it like an eel, and with his paws he gathered in the air. I do not think that there was greater fear in Phaeton when he let his reins go free, for which the sky, as one still sees, was scorched, nor in poor Icarus when he could feel, his sides unwinged because the wax was melting, his father shouting to him, "That way's wrong," than was in me, when on all sides I saw that I was in the air, and everything had faded from sight, except the beast. Slowly, slowly swimming, he moves on. He wheels, and he descends, but I feel only the wind upon my face, and the wind rising. Already, on our right, I heard the torrent resounding, there beneath us, horribly, so that I stretched my neck and looked below. Then was I more afraid of falling off, for I saw fires, and I heard laments, in which I tremble, crouching and hold fast. And now I saw what I had missed before, his wheeling and descent, because great torments were drawing closer to us on all sides. Just as a falcon, long upon the wing, who seeing neither lure nor bird, compels the falconer to cry, "Ah me, you fall," descends, exhausted, in 100 circles, where he had once been swift, and sets himself, embittered and enraged, far from his master. Such, at the bottom of the jagged rock, was Geryon, when he had set us down. And once our weight was lifted from his back, he vanished like an arrow from a bow. So what I love about that passage in the Inferno is it's like hundreds and hundreds of years old scene of flying on an airplane, right, through hell. Airplane, a monster airplane. But I think part of what always fascinated me about the underworld, even as a kid, was that it was just a place of adventure. I didn't really have like a moral, fear of ending up in hell someday. For me, the underworld was a place of wonder and terror and adventure and a place where heroism could happen. I played too much Dungeons and Dragons growing up. And so now I'm going to read from my next book, which is called Voyager. And it's a funny, odd journey through the underworld that this book takes. I became interested in a man named Kurt Waldheim. This is around 2005. I started reading about him. And some of you might remember who Kurt Waldheim was, and some of you weren't born yet. But Waldheim was the Secretary General of the United Nations in the 1980s. He's an Austrian political figure. And so, during roughly the Carter administration, that period of kind of Cold War geopolitical history, he was a kind of spokesperson for humanity. And those of you who remember Kurt Waldheim, and probably also remember that some years after his term as Secretary General of the UN, he was exposed as being a essentially a Nazi war criminal from decades earlier in his lifetime. It was revealed that he had served in Hitler's army as a SS officer and was responsible for sending many people to their deaths, and kept this secret for many, many years, and then rose from kind of secret war criminal to Secretary General. So I started to do something odd. I read his memoirs. I'd also just learned that Waldheim's voice right now is traveling into deep space on board the Voyager spacecraft, bearing greetings from humanity to whatever is out there in the dark. And the kind of ghastly strangeness of the voice of humanity carrying that dark secret with it felt like, in some ways, like that is the perfect person to be a spokesperson for us all, because all the complicities and complexities of being a human being at any time in any place. But it also started to feel to me like a way of thinking about what the poet was in society. And so I started erasing words from Kurt Waldheim's memoir. It's called In the Eye of the Storm. And he tells the story of his time at the United Nations, but he never says anything about his participation in Hitler's SS. I kind of was trying to find a secret, or find a poem, or find something in there, in his language. And so I'd cross out words, and I would keep words in their original order that started to feel like a poem to me. And this is, to make a long story short, what I found was another Inferno. So I'll read you a few sections from Voyager, this book that is an erasure of Kurt Waldheim's memoir, but in erasing his memoir, finds Waldheim on a journey through the underworld. And he's being guided by someone called the Minister, because the word minister appears a lot in his memoir, his ministers of defense and so on. But these are all Waldheim's words. This is from the fourth section of the third erasure I did of this book. Drawing to a close, he was quiet. So I said my name from time to time and wondered whether I sounded like myself. The minister pointed out a little book. Looking at the strange pictures, a black sun, the earth seen from inside, and war in a box. My, such pictures, a little gallery of being, I thought. But soon found unending regions of consequence under every image. Fields endless but visible behind every field. So I and the minister left for a quest under this world, thus seeking to return home in new country. Our little joke being, we don't believe we're making believe. Star fields prevailing in the east over the kingdom as a man considered a pile of bones. There he was, blunt under, resigned to his post. Under, I made under into a name. A loyal servant of the world above. Under had been serving for some time and had served perfectly well. But now perhaps he had drunk a glass too many, as he was known to do on occasion. For somewhere in the mountains, his wife was looking into her hands to see once more where Under lived. In a soft voice, he explained he could no longer return to his wife and daughter, because Under now served in nations of continual shadow. This beguiling man said, "Death is another home." smiling at my problems with the world in general, and particularly personality, that foreign little hole, which he advised me to bury completely. Here's another scene from Waldheim's journey through the underworld. I was led, and so it's Waldheim speaking, in my imagination. I was led to a globe, beholden to its vast revolution, a revolution living eyes could hardly credit. My life diminishing in scale, myself the moving woods they called the real, guided by a spirit to low countries in disarray. The patchwork of views emerged in negative, machinery in the fields, groundwork, the promise of form in the background. There was a universal man, a scholar of history. To exercise his heart, he would complain about love in front of the famous Chagall window. Autumn, that revision of the year covering the ground. One swallow moving south. Form working the levers. And I became a disciple of despair, for I had a long, good look at that world. Help, I said. In the first circle, the center of never, the minister had constructed a residence which included a private zoo where he kept a collection of exotic political leaders set in the midst of vineyards, the surrounding waters deep. His great concern, the erosion under the world. Greeting me there with dinner in mind, he launched his primitive harpoon at men in the dark. One gargled and spat. Then he swallowed the skin red and raw, which he insisted was the best way to eat a respected former congressman. Well, very well. It was an old, and this is my version of Geryon the monster, it was an old and somewhat shabby-looking falcon professing disbelief. Are you thing or king? I was impressed by the speech, hard indeed to respond, and facing him, I said, help. He was cooperative, and over that Sahara within, he invited me to cross beyond the fragile coast towards the wisest men. Friends, somewhat surprised by grace, I was flown to universal applause, from the west to the east summoned, asking the minister, my speech in disarray, is that legion I see, hitherto doomed? Climbing higher as new countries approached, taken up in the still atmosphere, and weighed down by an increasing mood of if only. I'm looking at my phone not because I'm expecting a call. I want to stay within the 45 minutes. There are a lot of hells out there, and it's just underworlds all the way down. But I'll unlike hell itself, this poetry reading will end. I'll read you from my third book, Underworld Lit, which I'm just remembering now. The literary award of which I'm least proud is that this book was named one of the top 10 horror poetry books by a website. So I wrote this book when I was I had a small child, and I was going up for tenure at the university where I work now, and received a cancer diagnosis. So I suddenly felt like I was in the underworld. And birth and death were in close proximity, and being judged, and feeling very precarious in the world. So I wasn't like in a great mood. I'll jump around the book a bit. This is section 16. A student visited my office the day before yesterday with some questions concerning her midterm exam. Apparently, I'd been a little dismissive of her worldview in my comments. As the conversation wore on, I found myself explaining that it would have been physically impossible for Dante to crawl through the center of Earth, because as everybody knows, the planet's core is very hot. But he went all the way through and saw the stars again, the girl insisted. Are you calling him a liar? She'd been homeschooled in a rural area downstate, and occasionally it required some additional learning support on my part. Once more, I tried to explain that nobody could pass through the world and come out the other side. It would be metaphysically implausible. Studying a loose tile on the ceiling, my visitor, whose name regrettably escapes me, seemed unconvinced. When I get to heaven, she rose suddenly to go, her face flushed. I will ask Dante. Classes were letting out for the day. The antiquated street lamps had begun to flicker on, one by one, across the main quad. Consulting my watch, I worried that I might be late for my appointment. And what if he ended up in the other place? I inquired, showing the girl out the door. Then you ask him. I love my students, actually. I'll rewind to the beginning of the book. 1. In the inky, dismal, and unprofitable research of a recent leave of absence from my life, I happened upon a historical prism of Ashurbanipal that I found to be somewhat disquieting. Of an enemy whose remains he had abused in a manner that does not bear repeating here, this most scholarly of Mesopotamian kings professes, I made him more dead than he was before. Prisms of this sort were often buried in the foundations of government buildings, to be read by gods, but not men. Somewhere in the shifting labyrinth of movable stacks, I could hear a low dial tone humming without end. In Ashurbanipal's library, there's a poem written on clay that corrects various commonly held errors regarding the venerable realm of the dead. Contrary to the accounts of Moulian, Madame Blavatsky, and Kwasi Benefo et al., it is not customarily permitted to visit the underworld. No, the underworld visits you. You know, I was saying before, certain circumstances in my life kind of led to the writing of this book, but also finding that quote from Ashurbanipal and realizing that the world of the dead is so vast, and that there are actually many worlds of the dead, right? There's a Mesopotamian vision of the afterlife. There's a Tang Dynasty Chinese vision of the afterlife. And the Tang Dynasty vision of the afterlife might be different from the Han Dynasty vision of the afterlife. The underworld keeps changing, right? And then there's the Mayan underworld, which is a very, very different place from the Chinese underworld. We think, well, yeah, but the one thing that these places, these imaginative places, these shared cultural places have in common is that they're a place of judgment, right? But that's not even true. So the Mesopotamian underworld is just a place of waiting. And we don't know what you were waiting for if you ended up in that underworld. And here's a passage, not from me, this is from the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oftentimes described as the first book, cuneiform tablets that are still being excavated, and we're getting more and more pieces of this poem even to this day. In fact, I think they just learned that there are monkeys in the Epic of Gilgamesh. They never knew that there were monkeys, but they found a fragment somewhere in Iraq, and now they know they're monkeys. So this is a scene in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first book, and in some ways the oldest underworld known to us, millennia old, where the hero Gilgamesh hears from his dear friend Enkidu a dream about the underworld. As Enkidu slept alone in his sickness, in bitterness of spirit, he poured out his heart to his friend. It was I who cut down the cedar, I who leveled the forest, I who slew Humbaba, and now see what has become of me. Listen, my friend, this is the dream I dreamed last night. The heavens roared, and earth rumbled back in answer. Between them stood I, before an awful being, the somber-faced man-bird. He had directed on me his purpose. His was a vampire face. His foot was a lion's foot. His hand was an eagle's talon. He fell on me, and his claws were in my hair. He held me fast, and I smothered. Then he transformed me, so that my arms became wings covered with feathers. He turned his stare towards me, and he led me away to the palace of Irkalla, the queen of darkness, to the house from which none who enters ever returns, down the road from which there is no coming back. So Enkidu in his dream is being escorted to the underworld. And this is what it looks like. There is the house whose people sit in darkness. Dust is their food, and clay their meat. They're clothed like birds, with wings for covering. They see no light. They sit in darkness. I entered the house of dust, and I saw the kings of the earth, their crowns put away forever. Rulers and princes, all those who once wore kingly crowns and ruled the world in the days of old. There's always days of old, no matter how old the poem is. They who had stood in the place of the gods like An and Enlil stood now like servants to fetch baked meats in the house of dust, to carry cooked meat and cold water from the water skin. In the house of dust which I entered were high priests and acolytes, priests of the incantation and of ecstasy. There were servers of the temple, and there was Etana, that king of Dish, whom the eagle carried to heaven in the days of old. I saw also Samukan, god of cattle, and there was Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld, and Belet Sheri squatted in front of her, she who is recorder of the gods and keeps the book of death. She held a tablet from which she read. She raised her head. She saw me and spoke. Who has brought this one here? Then I awoke like a man drained of blood, who wanders alone in a waste of rushes, like one whom the bailiff has seized, and his heart pounds with terror. So back to my own personal underworld. 3. For the past several years, I've taught an introductory course on world literature at the university where I'm presently employed. The offering has frequently proven to be a disappointment, both to myself and to the students, some in headscarves, some occasionally dressed in fatigues, who register for this seminar in order to satisfy their humanities requirement. As far as classes go, it was an almost painless experience. The instructor is fairly intelligent and enthusiastic about the material, but is unreceptive, even intolerant of anything that is not a poem or a poem in prose form. That's an actual course evaluation I got. Made me question things, including the value of higher learning. Looking over the feedback last summer, I began to consider a different approach. There would be new assignments, self-assessments, and regularly scheduled office hours this time around, followed by a transitional withdrawal of black gowns through the spring morning mist. And because I know comparatively little of this world, I've decided to work my way up from below. Four, Hume 101. Introduction to the Underworld, cross-listed with Divinity and Complet. In this course, students will be ferried across the river of sorrow, subsist on a diet of clay, weigh their hearts against a feather on the infernal balance, and ascend a viewing pagoda in order to gaze upon their homelands until emptied of all emotion. Texts will include the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Mayan Book of the Dead, the Ethiopian Book of the Dead, and Muriel Rukeyser's Book of the Dead. The goals of the seminar are to introduce students to the posthumous disciplinary regimes of various cultures, and to help them develop the communication skills that are crucial for success in today's global marketplace. All readings in English. Requirements include the death of the student, an oral report, and a final paper. 5. I promised my wife that I would call Dr. Song today. After putting Mira down for her nap and slipping outside for a smoke, I lifted the receiver. The sound it emitted, which I've heard without pause countless times before, seemed to me otherworldly now, like somebody's finger playing on the wet rim of a crystal bowl in a derelict theater before the wars. It's hard to say how long I stood there listening. It may have been seconds or seasons. The wings of Saturn kept turning in their groove. For reasons beyond me, our seminar had already moved on from late medieval Europe to developing world underworlds. I dialed 1-800 Inferno, and before the first ring, a woman's voice answered in heavily accented English. "Is it you?" "I think so," I replied. Outside, the honey locusts sprinkled their pale spinning leaves in real time. Focusing on one as it fell seemed to slow the general descent. "O creature, gracious and good," the faraway lady recited, as if reading against her will from a prepared text, traversing the dusky element to visit us who stained the world with blood. I could hear rain trickling in a gutter spout on the other end of the line. "Please," I said into the receiver, "remove my name from your list." 6. While outlining the requirements for our first critical essay of the term, I notice a hand rising in world historical time at the back of the classroom. "What if I'm ideologically opposed to revision?" asks the red-headed boy in a new slave's t-shirt. A city bus unloads its pageantry outside the window. A handful of sparrows erupts from the equestrian statue on the quad. I remember Sun Tzu's advice to humanities instructors, which I review on index cards at the outset of each academic quarter. Hold out baits to entice the enemy. Feign disorder and crush him. What exactly is your ideology? I ask, stroking my beard. I'm a Zen Next Light crypto-objectivist, replies my interlocutor. How about you? I have no choice but to improvise. Pro-recycling? Anti-genocide? A voice from beyond my peripheral vision says, "You're nothing but a pseudo-Kantian neoliberal mirage with meta-narcissistic tendencies." No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. So I think I'll just read a few little bits of a translation that happens in this book. And it's kind of a true story. I was reading about the hells of various cultures, and I got really interested in the Chinese underworld, which is a place very different from the ancient Mesopotamian or from Dante's visions of the underworld. It's more like you just have to go from one courtroom to another with your papers, and you get sent to another courtroom, and you keep trying to find your date with the judge, and it's just this huge bureaucracy. But the version of the story that I found, I could only find in French, which I don't really know. I mean, I can fake my way through a restaurant. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm going to try and translate this Chinese tale of the underworld. And so here's just the beginning of that translation in my very bad French. And I kept the mistakes in, and I'll surely go to like translator's hell, when the time comes for this. 8. In the district of Huchufu, the magistrate's assistant Chen was taking a nap in his cabinet of pain. Suddenly, a motorized airport staircase appeared and beckoned him to follow. The word in the French was satellite, and so when I looked it up in my Larousse dictionary, the first thing that came up was motorized airport staircase. So I just said, okay, we're just going to go with the motorized airport staircase. It led Chen down a path hidden by rustling thickets of bamboo to a clearing where on a high pedestal an enormous mirror waited in the moonlight. Regard what you once were in your previous life, said the staircase. Looking into the mirror, Chen saw a donkey muzzled with wire. The beast gazed sadly back at him from its muddy pen. Hummingbirds, the color of spilled oil, flitted across the frame. Now see what you were in the life before that one. Rubbing his eyes, Chen looked again. This time, he saw a girl wringing a bloody rag out of an upper-story window. Her lips appeared to be moving, but Chen couldn't make out the words to the song. Again, said the vehicle. Chen peered into the mirror once more. Where the girl had been, he now saw a high official in old Ming costume, black cap, red dragonfly robe, belt with jade buckle, bent over a faded map of some unfamiliar region. Just then a disheveled servant rushed into the clearing, prostrated himself before Chen, and exclaimed, "Don't you recognize me? I was your valet in Tatong Fu." But of course, that was over 200 years ago. Rising to his feet, he handed Chen a scroll. "What's this?" Chen asked dreamward. "See for yourself," the servant replied. "It will clear your name. Draft only. Please do not circulate. Trans. Ce n'est qu'un projet. Ne circule pas, s'il vous plaît. Trans. Jingong fei fa xiong, qing bu yao shun huan. Trans." Thank you.
Well, Chicu, thank you so much for this reading. This has been tremendous. How's the visit to Pittsburgh been so far?
It's been great. It's I used to come here in the summers with my family because the only Hindu temple that served the kind of community that my parents came from in the south of India was in Monroeville. And so we would drive up, and this is my own personal underworld, like big time, because I did not want to sit through these long cultural events, but we would come every year up here. And so it's kind of feels like coming back home.
Well, that's great. Well, we're happy to have you. And I know you're talking a little bit about that experience growing up and getting some of these serious cultural texts initially in sort of childhood form. So I know you're working on a new translation of the Mahabharata, and you said your initial contact was through a comic book, right?
Yeah, so I would, in the back of the car, when I wasn't torturing my sister like a demon from hell, I would be leafing through these Indian comic books. They're from a series called Amar Chitra Katha. Every Indian kid, knows about these. And they told the stories of heroes and gods and also really weird, like kind of folk tales that are that Aesop's fables actually came out of historically, but they're so badly translated into English that the morals made no sense whatsoever. There'd be like, a fable, an ancient Indian fable about a jackal getting torn to pieces by rats, and then the moral would be something like, don't be nice to rats or something like that.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I've been trying to think of my first encounter to ideas of the afterlife. I, probably too young in age, read The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, which, has anyone read this book before? It's in the early Christian patristic tradition, there's a sense of in Christian theology, evil, hell is described as an absence, right? Christians want to maintain that creation, insofar as it exists, is good. So hell is Augustine uses this language of like falling out of existence. So, and C.S. Lewis's underworld sort of, the farther you go into hell, the bigger it seems, but the farther away you go, the smaller it becomes, right? And you got the same kind of thing in Dante, where you move to the center of hell and it's frozen. It's the stasis. But was that your first encounter with the underworld, or where did this interest come from?
Yeah, it's one thing that's so fascinating about individuals' versions or images of hell at different points in their lives, when they're kids or when they're older or when they stop believing in that stuff. It's still something that you have an image of, and it keeps changing. And it changes across cultures, it changes across history. For me, I don't think I ever have believed in hell as a place. But I think I live deeply in the underworld as that kind of place of adventure, and literally like playing games with the Filipino neighbor kids, where we were pretending we were like elfin magicians, battling minotaurs, and that was huge for me when I was little. And that was a mythology that was every bit as important as the comic books about Indian culture, or reading D'Aulaire's Greek myths, or they're like hardwired into me. And I think it's also part of being human, and I think it's also strangely gendered in lots of ways. Although my daughter loved and still knows all of the Greek myths, and she reads the Indian comic books that they're still like stained with like mango pickle from when my uncles brought them over in their suitcases from India, and she reads them and she laughs at the bad translations. And, so I think, maybe as soon as you start to imagine other worlds, you start to imagine underworlds or places where the human and the non-human kind of are coexisting, sometimes in not great ways.
Yeah, I want to turn to the concept of fatherhood. You had a moment in one of your interviews that brought me to tears. I know that a lot of your poetry came from that place you described of birth and death being intertwined. My in-laws are in town from Mexico. My parents-in-law, which has been wonderful, and my wife. We have a 2.5-year-old at home. So this is top of mind. And you had this moment in one of your interviews where you talked about your role as a kind of Virgil to your daughter's Dante, and thinking about, we always think of what Virgil does for Dante. We don't think as much about what Dante does for Virgil. And so the question I wanted to ask is, as a poet sort of traversing the underworld, do you see yourself as more of a Dante or more of a Virgil?
That's great. Well, I think, for me, and actually I always forget to say this when I read from this book, because it's kind of about cancer too. And what I always forget to say is I'm okay now. I'm surgically cured. I'm like, no, nothing. Because sometimes people come up to me afterwards and they're like, are you okay? I mean, I saw you smoking out in front of the venue just before this thing started. So I'm okay, but I actually feel like my daughter was my Virgil in some ways through that time, because, I needed her, I think maybe more than she needed me in some ways, to get through that time. And so she was a funny, very short little Virgil who couldn't speak very well, and how I could easily pick up and, put in another room if I needed to. But I think one thing I feel like is my, unheroic struggle with cancer that ended well for me was totally comic. Like, I was not courageous at all. I was terrified. I couldn't deal with it. And I had more of like a Chaplin-esque journey through, cancer, where it was just full of pratfalls, and it was a very slapstick kind of thing. And what I love about, other stories of the underworld is how comical they are. When Dante gets on that giant monster and he's like, I don't want to do this, guys. That's where I identify with.
During those periods of really extreme stress and sort of contemplating mortality, sometimes poetry feels like a refuge. Other times you feel asphyxiated. What was the role of poetry in your life during that period?
So I don't really read poetry for like consolation, if I need to be consoled, I want someone to console me who's like a person. And so I went to poetry for escape. And I think I do. That's what I go to literature for. And it's not just escape from like tax day or, stuff like that. It's more an escape into other people's worlds and the reality of them. And then I feel, well, actually maybe consolation, right? And so for me, seeing how so many human beings had imagined what happens after we're no longer what we think of ourselves as for our lives. It was like a huge library, of the human imagination, and that was a place like I felt like I could go to, and I still find it endlessly fascinating.
I received a few questions people sent on social media and on our newsletter, and someone asked. I know you recently did an interview where you talked a lot about the idea of strangeness, and we did a high school visit. We went to Woodland Hills today, spoke with some students, and spoke with Wallace Stevens and strangeness. So I'd love that story. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe your intro to that Stevens poem and this idea of strangeness in poetry.
Yeah. So the first poem I fell in love with that actually kind of swept me off my feet was my freshman year of high school when, and I wasn't a poetry reader. I didn't think about poetry. I didn't care about poetry, but I had a great high school English teacher who had us read a really difficult, weird, strange poem called Disillusionment of 10 O'Clock by Wallace Stevens. And that's the poem that we talked about today with the high school students. And it's a poem about kind of getting your freak on in a way. It's about the fact that it's 10 o'clock at night. Wallace Stevens is in Hartford, Connecticut, and finished his day's work as a insurance executive. And he thinks to himself, well, tonight, these houses all around me on the street are full of people wearing exactly the same white nightgowns. Of course, he's thinking about them as ghosts in a way, right? But none of them are wearing purple nightgowns with green stripes or yellow nightgowns with blue stripes, or, they're all the same. Only here and there, drunk and asleep in his boots, an old sailor catches tigers in red weather, the poem ends. Right? Someone who doesn't live under one of these roofs is out having a wild dream. And so for me, that was a poem about weirdness, and how sad of a world we would live in if there was no weird people in it, and if we couldn't be weird sometimes, and that maybe this would be a better world if we were more strange. There's another great line of a poem of Stevens that ends with the line, "There I found myself more truly and more strange." I think that's what poetry helps us to find, is the strangeness inside us and the weirdness that makes us human and not just white nightgowns, floating through the night.
I love that. Yeah, it's poetry and it's certainly childhood. I told you, Lucy, our 2.5-year-old, pointed to the sky the other week and said, "It's not pink," and which is great. There's you might say, okay, obviously it's not pink, but there's in that this imagining of another kind of world, which I love so much. Everything that comes out of a 2-year-old's mouth.
Counterfactuals, a big part of childhood development is when they start to imagine counterfactuals. And she's like, she could imagine a sky that was pink in the middle of the day, right? And that's like telling reality from fiction, and involves imagining fiction.
One of my favorite things about your interviews generally is usually when people ask for writing advice, you give them reading advice, right? And as we speak with my students, one of the best ways to become a better poet is just to read as much as possible. And I got a great question. I sent around a podcast that Chicu did on shiki. There are 4 sort of great haiku masters in Japanese history, and Chicu, in addition to editing Phoenix Poets at the University of Chicago Press, is the poetry editor at the Paris Review. And the Paris Review released this great piece sort of talking about Shiki as the Ringo Starr of the 4 great haiku poets. Shiki had this great piece on poop. He writes about like what can a poet do? The actual word he uses is a little more sour, but he talks about what can a poet do with a really base image like bird droppings. Anyway, the question that was written in was, in terms of your own influences, do you have a John, Paul, George, Ringo, or a sort of Mount Rushmore letterbox of if you had to name 4 of your primary poetic influences?
What I love about that question is it's not just like who are your 4 favorite poets, but like which one is John, which one is Paul, which one is Ringo. And so I'm going to try and like be true to the spirit of the challenge of that question. I think Wallace Stevens is definitely a poet who is very important to me, even though I don't read him very much on a day-to-day basis. He's just like, you know, in my DNA, I think, because of when I started reading him and how long he was important to me. So let's call him Ringo, because he's just so weird. John, who's the John Lennon for me? I kind of feel like John Keats. You know, Keats was, I mean, they both died too young, and also is just a pure singer, you know, a pure sound artist who is made the language, you know, do things in your ear that, you know, I think no one else had done before. Paul's like is like amazing, but kind of a little bit vanilla, right? Is that the kind of take on Paul McCartney?
Yeah, John called him the grandma songs that he wrote.
Yeah,
Was John's Barb. Yeah,
yeah, the grandma songs. Okay, but he's a genius, right? Like the thing about Paul McCartney is, you know, I had a friend in college who used to say, you know, whenever we're listening to the Beatles, and getting overexcited about music, he would just say, Paul's bass, because he was reminding me to listen to Paul McCartney's bass playing and how incredible it was. So I'm going to say Emily Dickinson. You know, people think of Emily Dickinson as kind of like a Hallmark card poet, but if you hear what she's doing, and also one amazing thing about Emily Dickinson is everyone thought of her as like a spinster who never left the house and just wrote poems about like feeling insulted by her sister-in-law because she didn't share a cake recipe or something. But if you look at the index to Emily Dickinson's complete poems, it's like a map of the most exotic places in the world. You know, like Rarotonga is in her poems. So I think, yeah. And am I missing anyone? George. That's tough. I think maybe Gerard Manley Hopkins.
rock and roll. All right.
Okay, I'll leave it there. I won't geek out too much about the Beatles and about English language poets.
That's incredible. We've not talked about Hopkins on this visit so far. This was he's a sort of looms over the history of the forum. Sam Hazo wrote his master's thesis on Hopkins, which is, you know, Hopkins is a Victorian poet, but only really published in the 20th century. So Sam wrote sort of an early study of him, but beautiful. If you've never read Hopkins, I think great. I love you, George Harrison. That's phenomenal. Highly recommend. Great. We'll talk more
Guitar,
later.
you know, it's all guitar solos. Or Hopkins poems are just amazing guitar solos.
Right. Well, 2 more questions. Tons and tons of questions about the publication process. Right. So just a show of hands, how many poets or editors do we have in the room? All right. Yeah.
Surrounded.
About a majority. So lots of questions. I know I see some professional poets here who have living, breathing books out in the world. And then I see some of my students up there and some budding poets who may have never published anything before. So start at the very, very basic level. You know, you at the Paris Review, I'm sure, just have thousands of poems come across your desk. If you're going to provide advice to a 20-year-old poet who's never published before, just sort of practically, spiritually, what do you recommend in terms of getting their feet wet?
Wait. You know, don't. There's no rush. I think, you know, I'm going to give the advice you least want to hear, you know, as an aspiring poet who wants to get published. The world can wait for your poem to be in the world. We might not make it better, you know. And then, you know, the other thing I would say is, you know, to get published, to publish a book of poetry, to publish a poem, write a really good book. You know, write a poem that, you know, is incontrovertibly something that only you could write, right? And you'll find, if you imagine, if you've written a poem and you think, okay, I'm going to send this to the New Yorker or you know, wherever. Just imagine, like, could you imagine anyone else writing that poem? Here. And if you can, then wait, you know, and write the poem that only captures your eccentricity, your idiosyncrasy, your, not like what makes you so great, what makes you so odd, I think, actually. If you trust in that, then I think you'll be doing something really, really exciting. That's what Emily Dickinson did her whole life. Right? That's what all those other poets do. But, you know, if you feel like you're ready to do that, then, you know, I think one thing is to assume that the system is flawed, assume that there's no connection between rejection and the quality of what you're doing. We get, you know, 1,500 submissions every season at the Paris Review. We publish maybe 10 poems out of those 1,500 submissions. So I'm making enemies at an alarming rate. So there's no way to publish all of the wonderful writing that we see. We do our best, you know, but I think, you know, does that help?
Yeah.
So, final question. You are working on this translation / adaptation of the Mahabharata. How's it coming along? What's the future look like for this
Terribly.
project?
It's so painful. The Mahabharata is there are two Indian epics. One is called the Ramayana, and that's the fun one because they're like, there's an army of monkeys and an army of demons, and you know, lots of great stuff there. And the other is called the Mahabharata, and the Mahabharata is 8 times longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey put together. And so, of course, that's the one I chose to try and do an adaptation of. And I've been working on it for about a year, and I'm about 10 pages into it. So that's how it's going now.
That's great. Those must be 10 killer pages.
Not really. You know, I think, you know, a lot of being a writer for me is, you know, trying stuff and realizing that it's not working and being able to throw it out and start over again. And so I don't, that's why I didn't read any of that tonight.
That's great. Yeah. The last thing I'll say is Seamus Heaney was a longtime friend of the forum. He did 5 readings, 4 pre-Nobel Prize, 1 post. And you can listen to most of those on our website. The 1974 performance, I think, he read his poem Personal Helicon, the final poem of his first book. Tremendous poem. And he says the first 3, the quotation of his is, the first 3 stanzas would always have been the same, right? He sort of adapting the Coleridge quote of, you couldn't imagine it otherwise than what it is. He says the 4th could have been different, right? Had I been a different person. But so that's the poem he's striving after. Is he says, if you have a poem where all the lines couldn't be anything but what they are, that's when you have a a masterpiece. So I'm glad you're wading into it. I'm excited to see it. But
Thank you all.
we've been so happy to have you in Pittsburgh. Thank you everyone for coming. This has been a wonderful time, and thank you once again for your support. Our next event, our final of our relaunch season, is the folk legend Grammy winner Judy Collins, who was our third performer ever back in 1966. She's coming May 31st. We're releasing tickets on the 1st of May. It's going to be a free event, but the tickets are going to go very quickly. So they'll go out on our news list. So be sure you keep your eyes open for that. In the meantime, thank you again for your support. We are a single employee 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have an incredible team of interns and volunteers. So thank you to them. Thank you to Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. Thank you to LZH Hillman Foundation, Grable Foundation, our wonderful supporters. It means the world to have you coming out. Have a wonderful night. I hope this sends you back into the world thinking of greener pastures and
At least I'm not in hell,
fields.
Right?
But please join me in thanking our poet one final time.
Thank you.
Done.